My name is Justin Bull. I'm the third generation of my family to have gone to UBC. My grandfather studied law. My mother studied opera. My father studied forestry. My sister studied history. I've ended up here in the business school after doing some doctoral studies here. I also teach in the Faculty of Applied Science in the Masters of Engineering Leadership program. And I sit on a bunch of different boards, primarily working for First Nations in Canada on their economic development strategy. So that's a little bit about me. Today, the theme is the climate crisis in business. And this is something that's obviously very front of mind for many people around the world. And I think I could put it simply, this isn't good for business. Here on your screen, you see droughts in the Mississippi or in Shanghai and along the Rhine in Germany, fires in Greece or San Francisco or Australia. Like, none of this is good for business. This is volatility. This is instability. This is supply chains shutting down. Just all of this is bad for business. And so this is one of the biggest challenge I think that the private sector faces right now, is figuring out what kind of a role should we play in this? How do we manage for the additional volatility? But I think more importantly, what's the innovation opportunity here? What's the opportunity to lead? And that's something that's really infusing all of the work and teaching and research that we're doing, and certainly I'm doing at Sauder, as well as many of our peers. So we experienced how this is bad for business last year in British Columbia. Those from Canada will be familiar with this story. We had a brutal heat wave, right? We had the highest temperatures ever recorded in Canadian history. 3 days later, the town that experienced those temperatures, a little place called Lytton, British Columbia, burnt to the ground, almost wiped off the map. 6 months after that, we have the biggest floods in British Columbia's history. Enormous amount of the lower mainland of British Columbia, some of the most productive agricultural land in BC, was completely flooded in an area called the Sumas Prairie. And you see this kind of feedback loop kicking in, where you get extreme temperatures, and extreme temperatures result in extreme fire risk, and extreme fire risk results in extreme fires. That denudes the landscape. That means that when you get heavy rainfall, there isn't the ability to absorb all that heavy rainfall. You get excess water in our river systems. There's too much water, and the cycle continues. And you know, we could look at this through a lot of different lenses. We could evaluate this from a perspective of ethics, morality, and like, what's the right thing? What does your sense of ethics ground you in? What sense of justice do you hold? And that's all valid, right? That's all valid and important, you know, identifying your own personal values. But, you know, it's also interesting to look at it just through the sheer lens of, like, how do we create profit? How do we manage a business sustainably in the long run? How do we remain accountable to our shareholders and the stakeholders that are important to us? And the climate crisis is essentially just consuming us. It's changing all of the assumptions that we might make about how organization functions. So in the business world, we've been talking about this idea of the triple bottom line. And this is this idea that you make a decision when it's both environmentally, socially, and economically responsible. And that's what those of us like myself who've been sort of beating the drum of sustainability inside, you know, B school for a while. This is what we've been talking about. Is like, hey, look, treat people, planet, and profit with equal importance. And when you do that, be good for society, good for your business, good for the planet. But there was something we observed. We knew that if a company was profitable, it didn't really matter if they did all that much for people and planet, right? It was like profit was enough. Right? If you had a little left over, you might sprinkle some here over on planet, sprinkle a little bit here over on people. But the reality is, we were trying to nudge people to the middle here, this equal footing, this three-legged stool, so to speak. But what the climate crisis is teaching us, what COVID is teaching us, is that, look, this is the wrong model. We have to understand that our profit systems, that our economies are nested within a society, and that society is nested within a natural world. And when that natural world sends signals, right, whether it takes the form of a environmental crisis like a drought or a flood or a heat wave, or whether it's the form of a virus, that signal, that feature of nature shapes and constrains what society finds acceptable. And by turn, what society finds acceptable shapes and constrains what the business school, not the business school, but like the business community at large is allowed to do. So it's like, no, you're going to have to shut down. And I'm sorry if you don't like that, but that's what we have to do to protect people's lives. Oh, I'm sorry, you're going to have to price and manage your carbon emissions, because that's what we need to do in order to effectively manage the risk of climate change. right? And so you can see the parallels here between the COVID crisis and the planetary crisis, how they just operate in very similar ways. We can learn a lot from this crisis that we're still sort of in the midst of. Some of you may remember there was a time where we tried to flatten the curve, where we, don't contact too many people, stay at home, wear a mask, right? Isolate, reduce social contact. Why did we care about this? Well, the idea was that if you reduced your social contact, you might not overwhelm hospital resources, right? The more people you were in touch with, the more likely the virus was to spread. And so a lot of people would get sick and the hospitals would just be overwhelmed. And so everyone understood this idea of, hey, flatten the curve, please. And in the midst of this, the climate scientists were like, hey, that's a good idea. Like, can we flatten this curve too? Right? If we carry on with business as usual, we're going to overwhelm the carrying capacity of the earth. We're going to overwhelm the atmosphere. We're going to overwhelm our oceans. We're going to overwhelm our natural systems in a variety of ways. And if we do so, we're going to break things, and we're going to break things, and it's going to have disastrous consequences for, our ability to thrive as a species, for businesses' ability to thrive, for individuals' ability to thrive. So we don't want to do this. Let's just prioritize sustainability. Let's stretch this out. Let's change the values that we're managing for. So I want to encourage you to think through the 6-step process of a warning, denial. It becomes too difficult to ignore. An expensive solution is identified, but the longer you wait to implement, the more expensive it becomes. And so we eventually act. And you can see again with COVID, we saw this unfolding over a few months, right? Where you had, people saying, hey, there might be a novel pneumonia virus kicking around Wuhan. And everyone's like, no, there's not. There's nothing going on. Don't worry about that. And then it was like, oh, wait a second. The bodies are starting to pile up. There's a lot of sick people. We're going to have to do something about it. And initially, people wanted to try and cover that up to pretend it wasn't really happening, but it just got too hard to ignore. And we recognized that the solution was really expensive, which is why political leaders were so loath to take it. Lockdowns are expensive, shutting down the economy, society, the restaurants, the hotels, the international travel. It's a pain. And so nobody wanted to do it until you realize that if you don't do it, it's just going to be way worse. And so the longer you waited, the harder it was to manage. So we acted. It was 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit when the United Nations all came together and countries from around the world were like, climate is a big deal. All right, it had been understood as a climatological phenomenon, the greenhouse gas effect, and there was lots of people who were sort of early on in identifying the risks here. But 92 represented a bit of a tipping point, so to speak, in the international consciousness of the risks that climate change presents. And yet, we didn't act. We had a Kyoto Protocol of 1996, but that didn't really constrain anything. And then we have a COP process that's meeting again and again and again, and another agreement and another meeting and another agreement, and nothing really, happened. And there was a lot of effort to say, well, maybe the science is uncertain. Maybe this is all not quite as risky as we think. Maybe we're overreacting, right? Do we really want to screw up the economy? And now we're like, oh, okay, well, we've ignored this for 30 plus years. And it's now more expensive to not deal with climate change than to deal with climate change. It's more expensive to deal with the volatility and the risk and the disruption to our business and our way of life than it is to just deal with it. And so the whole argument that this is too expensive and we ought not to do something, it's gone. And so we've entered a paradigm now where planetary realities dictate economic and political realities. And this is new. This is like a new chapter in how human civilization organizes itself. The 20th century was a story of unlimited sort of resource consumption and unlimited dumping of the byproducts of our industry into the atmosphere, into our waterways, into the land. We just didn't care. It was like a take, make, waste paradigm. And now we've hit a tipping point where that's just not acceptable anymore. Our rivers are saturated. Our climate is saturated. Our oceans are saturated with the byproducts of human activity. And we have to do better. And so increasingly, the companies that do well, the societies that thrive, the individuals that thrive will be the ones that recognize this reordering of relationships, that the real opportunity to lead, the opportunity to innovate, lies in acknowledging planetary realities and understanding how they constrain and shape economic and political realities. And for a lot of folks, this is a grim story. Right? This is a story of failure. This is a story of sadness. This is a story of despair and anger. but just despair and anger are not a plan. Right? They don't unlock anything. You can't do anything with despair and anger. You might tweet better or glue your hand to a wall. But what else are you going to do with that? And so the framing that's coming from the sort of the venture capital world and the sort of the more technological world, the more optimistic framing, I think, is, look, this environmental crisis is just truly the biggest business opportunity in history. And oddly enough, this is now sort of a widely held view across industries, across countries, across different kinds of investors and financial organizations. Everybody is seeing that addressing this is just a great way to grow. Because like what else are we going to do here, right? Do we need like more Ubers? Do we need better online shopping? Like that's saturated, that's done. You want to make a photo sharing app? Like what do you got left here? Solving questions of food security, health security, solving questions of air conditioning and heating, solving questions of water security. Like those are the interesting problems left. And so what I want to start with is maybe give it a little bit of a baseline, because we have, as Tina did a great job with that poll, showing that we have people from around the world. So I've spoken from like the British Columbian experience. And what I want to hear is from your experience. Like we got folks from all over. What kind of climate outliers have you experienced in the last 12 months? And maybe more interestingly, how have those impacted business? And so please feel free to throw up your hand and I'll call on you, or just throw out the ideas in chat. But I'd like to make this a little interactive. I don't want to just talk for 45 minutes. You'll get bored of me by then. So, and any ideas, friends? Minus 40 degrees weather in Fort McMurray significantly delayed our project program. Yes, well put. Nazia is mentioning the floods in Pakistan. Braden's mentioning the summer in the United Kingdom. Interior of British Columbia was really isolated during floods. So warm in Manchester, it was crazy. So everyone's identified the outliers, but how did this impact your business, right? So there you go. Thank you, Nazia, right? You're saying that it was in maybe minimum of $10 billion of infrastructure. Naveen, please, there's a hand. Go ahead, Naveen.
I moved from India, from the town which was the industrial hub for coal, cement, and thermal. And the temperatures were around 28 to 32 degrees when I was a kid. But there is a story of many families who have migrated, and the temperatures in summer now hit 50, 51.
Yeah.
And there's a discussion that the Middle Eastern temperatures will thrive in India, and it will be unlivable in many parts of the country. And these are not plains or mountains. These are dense forests which go completely dry because of extreme summer heat. And the businesses, the cement factories have closed, the coal factories have closed. So even the business has shifted. The entire economy of the city has changed from the industrial economy to commercial economy because of the rising temperatures.
Interesting. That's a wonderful example. Very well put. Thank you, Naveen. And great examples in chat as well, Andrew, correctly. Things start to shut down. It's either too isolated, or from rains, you can't ship or receive goods. Supply chains grind to a halt. In London, the tubes shut down because it's too hot. People can't get to work. You can't get to tourist events, whatever, like retail shuts down. Like I think and Nana, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, is identifying, look, there was just fires. I remember this in London. It's like there's fires everywhere because it's just so damn hot. So let me repeat this idea. It is cheaper to deal with the climate crisis than to not deal with it. And that's where we find ourselves, right? We find ourselves saying these disruptions to industry, to supply chains, to tourism, to retail, to finance, that is way more expensive than whatever the solutions are in this space. And that is the reality that the business community is finally waking up to. One of the great leaders in this space is Mark Carney, right? Former governor of Bank of Canada, Bank of England, UN Special Envoy on Climate Finance. Fantastic guy. Great book on values. Yeah, published a couple of years ago. And Carney offered this report in 2017, sort of looking forward, like where are temperatures going to go? What's business as usual? How bad is it going to be? Blah, 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 blah. And he said to folks, look, you got two choices. You either have transition risk or physical risk, but that's it. There is no scenario that's risk-free, right? You're either going to deal with, an incredible increase in volatility, in disruption to your supply chains and operations, or you're going to deal with, the cost of transitions. And that could be disruption of pension portfolios, disruption of regional economies, destruction of shareholder value for people who are overexposed to, emissions intensive sectors of the economy. And so Carney's whole thing was like, let's have an orderly transition. Like the sooner we start this, the less disruptive the transition becomes. The longer we wait, the more expensive and painful the transition becomes, the more resistance to the transition you might find. And we get a whole bunch of additional physical risk. And so that's the kind of lens that the financial community is bringing to this space. Is this like, let's identify risk. And isn't that like I find it remarkably productive to think about climate just through a lens of like risk. It's boring, it's quantifiable, right? And you're not sitting around like humming and hawing about whether you should rebel or not. You're just saying, look, let's identify risk and articulate a plan to do something about this. And so we recognize that we have a truly wicked problem. This is a graph that shows sort of historical emissions, 1850 to 2017. And you can see Rio, 1992, we have seen an enormous increase of emissions since then. And again, you can see the problems of justice starting to kick in here because, developing countries are like, well, the Americans and the Europeans are responsible for all the historical emissions prior to 1975. The Americans and the Europeans are like, well, yes, but we've capped and are now reducing our emissions. And other countries are quickly growing their emissions. And we can't have a climate solution that doesn't involve them. And so everyone's like kind of fighting about who's responsible for this, that, and the other. And it's like almost like overwhelming our capacity to make decisions internationally. And this is a problem. This is a problem. But what's kind of remarkable is like quietly is you might be upset with, COP26. You might be upset with COP27. You might say it's not enough. We're not doing enough. And a lot of voices that are doing a great job articulating why. But what I think is interesting is that the number of economies, certainly the amount of global GDP that has committed to some level of net zero, right? That is that by 2050, their economies in aggregate will emit no additional CO2 equivalents into the atmosphere. So this is going to be an intervention of technology, changing of industrial processes, changing of policy, taxation of carbon, all sorts of tools to nudge us in that direction. And that's now the majority of global GDP. Now, you might be skeptical of this. You say, well, a Republican is going to win the presidency in 2024, and they're going to unwind all of those commitments. Or a conservative will win in Canada in 2023, and they'll unwind all. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. But so then let's just reduce the amount of GDP, right? So you say 35% of GDP hits net zero. Even 35% of GDP hitting net zero is like a staggering restructuring of the global economy, like staggering. It is the trend that we saw on the previous graph in reverse. It is unwinding these CO2 emissions more quickly than the rate at which they increased. And so that touches like every conceivable part of the global economy, every conceivable part. Bill Gates is famous for saying that essentially, if we do this, it's the most ambitious thing humanity has ever achieved. It's more ambitious than the green revolution, fertilization and selective breeding that allowed us to increase agricultural productivity. It's more ambitious than the digital revolution that connected us all together with the internet. It's more ambitious than the antibiotic revolution and the health revolution of vaccines in the early 20th century. Bigger than all of that. It's like taking all of those things, those profound structural things, and bundling them together and carrying it out over now 28 years. And so again, you can be dubious of all of this and skeptical of it, or you can return back to the thesis I promoted earlier, which is this is the biggest business opportunity ever, right? This is life-changing. And so the International Energy Agency sort of mapped out what does this require of us, this move towards net zero. And they're setting aside natural systems, food systems. They're just looking at energy systems. And they recognize that, look, in 2020, there's 34 gigatons of global emissions from the power, industry, transportation sector. Those are the big three, and then everything else a little bit smaller. And that our goal is to essentially shrink that outer circle, right, down to zero in 30 years. And the first thing you start with is shrink, is power. And then you go to transportation, and then you go to industry. There's sectors that are hard to abate, sectors that are difficult to abate, but you can just get a sense of the scale of the challenge, right? We've already seen, incredible deployment of capital into these spaces. We've seen incredible interest in trying to decarbonize these areas. We have at Sauder, we host a creative destruction lab, CDL Climate theme that is all about companies who are trying to tackle this. Climate capital is an incredibly lucrative place in the midst of crypto being revealed to be an emperor with no clothes, in the midst of Facebook having a business model that no longer seems to make sense, Twitter emulating Venture capitalists are desperate for something that's actually useful. And do you know what's useful? Solving the climate crisis. And so they're all moving in that direction, and they're moving aggressively. And so you see this thesis of ESG is essentially exploding, right? You see the S&P forecasting like just bonds, essentially a doubling year over year over year issuance of debt associated with resolving climate crisis, right? And again, it's difficult to understate how quickly this has happened, right? Where it goes from completely niche to incredibly mainstream. The bonds necessary to build the capacity, the industrial capacity, the electrification capacity, the water systems, the food systems, everything that will be necessary to address this crisis, right? The tailwinds essentially are at the back of resolving the climate crisis. And so the big areas of attracting investment at the moment are largely electrified transportation and renewable energy. Why? Because the technical risk is now low, right? It's not risky technologically to address these problems, and there's an enormous market opportunity. The total addressable market is in the trillions of dollars, and so capital is basically flooding into this space at a compound annual growth rate of like 48% for electrified transportation, energy storage at 32%. It's just wild how quickly this is changing. And so we're seeing early evidence of what happens when all of this capital starts to flow into a particular sector of the economy. This is looking at global sales and sales market share of electric cars 2010 to 2021. So 2010, it was essentially a non-existent industry. A few, people had Nissan Leafs, and that was about it. By 2021, you can see that there's millions of new registrations a year, at an excess of 6 million a year, and that EV car sales represent something close to 9% of car sales. Now, every major automotive manufacturer has essentially, acknowledged that they are going electric. They're not investing in new internal combustion engine drivetrains. They're going to squeeze the internal combustion engine for everything it's worth, but electric is the future for all of these companies. It was not, Tesla really changed the game. Then VW had to follow them, and then Honda had to follow them, and then Volkswagen had to follow them, and then Toyota had to follow them. And now the industry is just locked in to an entirely different future. Now, a lot of people think electric cars are going to save the world, right? They require a lot of materials, a lot of energy, a lot of metals, a lot of minerals. There's some downsides to this, but nonetheless, it's evidence that we can change more quickly than we thought, right? Nobody thought it was going to happen this fast. And so the framework that helps us understand these transitions is a classic. It comes from 1962, Rogers' Diffusion of Innovation framework. And really what it does is describe how incumbents have a very hard time dealing with challengers, right? So challengers start off with an innovation trigger, and they get some early adopters, some enthusiasts, some whatever it might be. And then they hit this sort of inflection point where everybody suddenly no longer wants to go to Blockbuster. They all want to go to Netflix, right? They're like, why am I going to a video rental store? This doesn't make any sense. I want to stream, right? Everybody stops using a landline and starts using a smartphone, because like the landline had nowhere to go here, right? If your business model was selling landlines, you had to pivot. You had to find a way to provide some other source of value to customers, or you were going to go bankrupt. And so the landline company, the Blockbuster, the traditional industry struggles to compete with these challengers who come along and figure out a different way of creating value for society, right? And this is a framework that is played out across dozens of industries, dozens of countries. But I want to apply it to one that I think is most relevant to the question of climate, which is total primary energy. And so here you're looking at growth in fossil fuel consumption and growth in renewable energy consumption. And you can see they've coexisted for some time, but that we are now in the era of peaking, right? The 2020s are era of peaking primary energy from fossil fuels, and renewables are essentially making up all of the growth. Now, if you work in finance, right, if you're lending someone some money, you want to lend someone money, someone who works in a sector where it's like, we think your future is shrinking. We think the future of your industry is smaller than the present. That's a terrible financial bet. That scares investors off. When they look at an alternative, let's say a renewable energy project developer, renewable energy technology, whatever it might be, and that alternative says our future is growth, right? We're going in the right direction here. So you're seeing the capital start to reallocate. And again, we're just in the early stages of this. We're like in that EV transition where, it's year 5 and it's a small amount, but the tailwinds are all at the back of the renewable energy transition. And what's kind of remarkable is how both COVID and the crisis in Ukraine have accelerated and compressed this time frame. A lot of people are worried about what winter is going to be like in Europe. And I think rightfully so. It's going to be challenging. There's going to be, there could be excess mortality. There could be suffering. There could be people, old people at home wearing a sweater with it's going to be rough, but industries are going to shut down too. There's like real fundamental, resource constraints that the Europeans are facing, but they are now essentially all in on the renewable energy transition. Like the best way to win the political conflict is to transition off of fossil fuels. And suddenly, I think, developed economies, liberal democracies are all collectively waking up to this. It was like, there's like a massive win-win here. The more we invest in renewables, the more we undermine the economic security of the nation states that pose a threat to us internationally. You want to undermine the Iranian regime? Stop using oil. You want to undermine the Russian regime? Stop using oil. You want to weaken the position of Saudi Arabia? You stop using oil. It becomes like a national security argument. And so suddenly this has gone from like Greta Thunberg saying you're not doing enough to do something about climate change, blah, 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 to like the Pentagon, the US military being like, climate is a national security issue, let's invest in renewables. This is not something that anybody saw coming 5 years ago. And so one of the books that does a great job sort of unpacking what this all means is a project called Drawdown. It's edited by Paul Hawken. It came out a few years ago. And essentially what it is like a plan. Because let me repeat, like despair and anger is not a plan, but neither are hopes and dreams. Plans are like objectives and key results. Like what's the sector of the economy? How are you going to attack it? How are you going to shrink the footprint there? And so the plan that Hawken provides covers like 100 different technologies. And I don't have the time today to talk about every single one. And he essentially says, what's the price? What's the CO2 abatement? What's the cost savings? How's this all going to work? And so he talks about the importance of scaling up, onshore and offshore wind, onshore and offshore solar, decentralized solar, domestic solar, all sorts of things in that space. He talks about how there's nascent technologies in tidal energy and nascent technologies in wave energy, using the movements up and down of waves, the back and forth of tide to create energy. This is an example of a project off the coast of Scotland and another example in the Bay of Fundy in Nova Scotia here in Canada. He talks about the fact that there's going to be a nuclear renaissance. Whether we like it or not, we are going to extend the lifespan of our existing nuclear assets, and we are going to invest in new small modular reactors, which are cheaper, more reliable, and substantially safer. They don't create any of the byproducts of fuels. They're not capable of having a meltdown the way Fukushima or Chernobyl or 3 Mile Island. And so again, he wrote this book in 2017. It's playing out pretty well. This was a good prediction. Look at California, Diablo Canyon, extending the lifespan of that plant. Germany extending the lifespan of their plants. France saying, we better build more nuclear. Canada now making its first investments in new nuclear. In Pickering, Ontario, they're extending the lifespan of the plants there. Right. So you're seeing real movement in this space. You're seeing a big movement in what's called district energy. This is where you connect like industrial, commercial, residential buildings together, and you give them one combined energy plant. It turns out that if you use a facility like this, it's much more efficient at producing the hot water and steam or cooling that our neighborhood might need. And so UBC is a district energy system. Olympic Village in Vancouver is a district energy system. This is an example of the energy facility under the Cambie Bridge here in Vancouver. I hope you have a chance to visit it. But there's bigger district energy systems. The city of Richmond, which is just outside of Vancouver, just announced a huge district energy system for one of its largest residential developments ever. So again, this is attracting enormous amounts of capital, of interest from investors. We know that we had to do something with our old waste to landfill. We're biogasifying garbage, right? So this is Cache Creek, British Columbia, about 4 hours away from Vancouver. It's an old landfill, and they're taking the rotting garbage and they're turning that into essentially an equivalent to natural gas. But one of the simplest climate solutions is just eat more vegetables. And this is, it's not like, be a vegan. It's not It's just eat more vegetables. Like the campaign that seems to be really effective is one called reducitarianism. Right? Just reduce your meat consumption. Maybe that's enough. So we have to change how we do agriculture. On your screen here, you see examples of what's called polycropping or crop rotations, where instead of growing a whole bunch of one single crop in a field, you grow a variety of crops which help each other out, right? Some of them fix nitrogen, some of them keep away pests and bugs. The net benefit is that you can reduce fertilizer consumption, and you can reduce fertilizer consumption, and you can also reduce the pesticides and herbicides and fungicides that are necessary to keep the crops healthy. And crop rotations are where you own a large farm, and one year you do wheat, the next week you do barley, the next year you do clover, the year after that you let it run fallow, right? You move in that direction. We know that we have to equip, in developing countries, we have to equip people with better cooking instruments. Giving a woman in a household in sub-Saharan Africa a stove, that's a climate solution, because typically she's burning over an open fire, right? Cooking dinner over an open fire. And this is not ideal. If you look at the thermal mechanics of all of this, it requires way more, combustion of wood to boil that pot of water than it would if you had a smart little stove. And so this is like a climate solution. Protecting really valuable, biodiverse, rich lands, like the Great Bear Rainforest that's north of Vancouver on the coast of British Columbia, which has this spirit bear, right? That is a climate solution. Turning our urban areas into forests, right? Whether it's suburban regions or downtown regions, like that is a climate solution. Making our urban areas prioritize humans over cars, right? Stopping our love affair with the automobile, and instead helping to build cities that are easy to get around, easy to transport. That's a climate solution. Turning our workplace or our education into something virtual. Like, you don't have to come to the office every day. We can host a course online. Turns out the world doesn't fall apart, right? You don't want to do all your courses online, but you can do some. And it's not the end of the world. And here we are engaging in that right now. Companies like Levi's are trying to replace all of the cotton in their supply chain with hemp, because it requires a fraction of the water, a fraction of the land base, a fraction of the fertilizer, and it produces a high quality product. It's a little stiff, a little scratchy. So they're trying to figure out the mechanical and chemical treatments necessary to get hemp to be a good alternative to cotton. But their goal is to essentially get off cotton. That's a climate solution. And so what Hawken does is he identifies these 100 solutions, and he said, look, this is what they are. This is the atmospheric CO2 concentration. This is what it's going to cost, and this is what we're going to save. And what's both thrilling but terrifying is the conclusion that we need them all. You have to do it all. You can't just do 5 of them. You have to do them all. But what's thrilling is that they're all de-risked. Like, these all exist. You don't need to go do a PhD in engineering to make one of these things happen. You just need to be like, you know what? I'm all about encouraging a plant-rich diet. I'm all about, intercropping of trees. I'm all about managing, cook stoves in developing countries. And I'm going to focus on that. Because one of the challenges we have in the climate crisis is people thinking they need to solve it all. Like, I need to find every area where humanity is falling behind. I need to find every point of pain. I need to find every contradiction or point of hypocrisy. It's like, your job is not to solve it all. Your job is just to pick one of these things and scale it. And so that's where the tools and language of business are most successful and most necessary. Because what all of these things need are business ideas, business people, business leaders. You don't need activists. They don't need tweeters. They need people who would just roll up their sleeves and do the hard work of scaling this. And then we address the climate crisis. So about 12 years ago, a gentleman, Mark Andreessen, a very, very famous and successful venture capitalist, wrote an essay called "Why Software is Eating the World." And in this essay, he essentially articulated the hypothesis of his organization, which is to go out into the world and find sectors of the economy where digital technology has not really changed things, right? And so some of the early examples that he offered was like, look, I don't think technology has really changed the hotel industry. I don't think technology has really changed transportation, to give you just 2 examples. And so he looks at technology, he looks at the hotel industry, he thinks there's low levels of change, and he says, I'm going to invest in startups that might address that problem. So startup number one, digitizing hotels, was Airbnb. Startup number two, digitizing transportation, was Uber. Now those have gone from being startups to basically verbs, which is an extraordinary transition. And the next version of Andreessen's thesis is essentially, okay, if software is eating everything, right? And that's an investment thesis. That's a lens for me to bring to my decision making about how the world should function. The next wave of this is how climate is eating everything. Our food systems, our health systems, our energy systems, our transportation systems, our building systems, our manufacturing systems, our retail systems, our financial systems. All of those are waking up to and adapting to the reality of climate. It is eating everything. John Doerr, who is the engineer and venture capitalist who coined the phrase objectives and key results. He was one of the early investors in Amazon and an early investor in Google. He just gave $1 billion donation to Stanford for a school on sustainability. Like, this guy is just like a OG of like climate capitalism. And in his view, the climate revolution is going to be way bigger, way more disruptive, and way more profitable than the digital revolution, because it actually solves people's problems. And it's deeply needed. And so one of the activities that we work through with our students is to ask themselves, how's climate changing your career? How's climate changing your organization? And one of the classic ways of describing how an organization creates profit is to think through the primary and support activities that result in a margin. This is what Michael Porter's value chain analysis. And we always make the argument, it's like, you tell me which part of this doesn't get touched by climate. Like, there could be a part, don't get me wrong, there might be some, maybe your procurement strategy doesn't have to change. But look, the human resources, look, young people don't want to work for a climate villain. They're motivated to work for a firm that they think is helping. Your procurement strategy has to change, because you now suddenly have to think about disruption in volatility in all of the supply chains you've historically relied on, where you get your goods, how you operate your factories, where your goods go, how you sell them, how you service them. Climate eats everything. We encourage folks to think through a SWOT analysis. This is I don't know what to do on this case study. Do a SWOT. It's like the best place to start. And we ask yourselves, look, think about your company. Think about what you do well, what you do poorly. Think about the external market, where there's opportunities, where there's threats. Think about your peers, what they do well, what they do poor. It is really easy to see how climate affects all of this. And so this sort of pervasive, ubiquitous nature of climate is exactly what informs our approach at Sauder to climate education, right? So we're really proud to be sort of building and growing a set of course offerings in our MBA that walk students through all of these different fields, right? Walks them through thinking through climate economics and markets, right? So like a sort of a macro view of the economic dynamics of climate change. But then we get folks to think about the innovation opportunities of climate change, and there's a dedicated course on that. We get folks to think about ESG and climate accounting, like how is the big four accounting firms in the investment world and the banks, how are they accounting for, measuring, reporting, disclosing climate information? We get folks to think about the climate crisis through the lens of supply chain management, right? Because again, this is so embedded in the operational reality of almost every company. We get folks to think about the opportunity to create real positive environmental and social good through an impact investing lens. We help students get embedded in one of the world's premier sort of venture incubators called the Creative Destruction Lab, where they get to spend almost 4 months working directly with a climate-focused, rapidly scaling technology company. We get folks to think about, how do we use climate as a way to communicate? How do we use this to grow sales? How do we use this to nudge people in the right direction? And then, because it's so relevant to the Canadian context, we also get folks to think about the intersection of the project of reconciliation with addressing the climate crisis. So that's the approach that we take. And I hope that some of you come and join us on that journey.